Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with emerging evidence of a war crime following a closed-door intelligence briefing at which a select group of Republican and Democratic lawmakers saw the full video of the September 2nd strike on a small boat allegedly shipping drugs to the United States. In spite of the alternative reality expressed by Senator Cotton, it appears that the second missile strike on Hegseth's orders to, quote, kill them all was murder on the high seas, and that if and when the public saw the video, the case against Hegseth would be devastating. Joining us is Rachel VanLandingham, a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, the Co-Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School, as well as a former judge advocate in the United States Air Force. During her military career, she served as a senior legal advisor on the international law of armed conflict, military prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, appellate defense attorney, and nuclear security inspector stationed in the United States, South Korea, and Italy with deployments to the Middle East. She was a legal advisor for international law at headquarters of the United States Central Command, where she advised on operational and international legal issues related to the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Then we'll examine the Supreme Court's overturning of a lower court in Texas that halted the implementation of a gerrymandered electoral map Trump demanded of Governor Abbott that would give Republicans 30 of the 38 House seats in next year's election before a vote is cast. Joining us to discuss how Alito's claim that it was, quote, pure and simple partisan advantage, not racial gerrymandering, even though the result will disenfranchise the state's minority voters, is Lydia Camarillo, the president of Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based out of San Antonio, Texas. She plays a key role in developing the tactical strategies for the SVREP nonpartisan voter registration, voter education, and Get Out the Vote campaigns. President Clinton and Vice President Gore appointed Lydia to serve as the CEO of the 2000 Democratic National Convention. Then Background Briefing's Gen Z reporter Sasha Linden Cohen interviews Jordan Schwartz, a sophomore studying political science at Harvard's Kennedy School. He recently co-chaired the Harvard Vote Challenge through the 2024 election, working to get out the vote on campus and beyond. He also serves as the chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project, which runs the flagship Harvard Youth Poll, the premier survey on the political opinions and civic attitudes of young Americans ages 18 to 29, which just released their findings for the fall of 2025, which finds that only 13% of Americans between 18 and 29 say the U.S. is heading in the right direction, with only 39% supporting capitalism. Then finally, we'll speak with Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the U.S. Supreme Court and other levers of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. She's the author of the new book, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and his accomplices rewrote the Constitution and dismantled our rights. And we will discuss how Roberts just gave the Republicans 5 more House seats in Texas and is about to kill off the Voting Rights Act and hand Trump the power to fire independent agency officials at will. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty. But more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible to restore democracy and civility and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And joining us now is Rachel VanLandingham, who's a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, the Co-Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School, as well as a former judge advocate in the United States Air Force. During her military career, she served as a senior legal advisor on the international law of armed conflict, military prosecutor, criminal defense lawyer, appellate defense attorney, and nuclear security inspector stationed in the United States, South Korea, and Italy, with deployments to the Middle East. She was the legal advisor for international law at Headquarters United States Central Command, where she advised on operational and international legal issues related to the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Welcome to Background Briefing, Rachel VanLandingham.
Thank you, Ian, for having me back.
Well, thanks for joining us, Rachel. And I think the context that we need, though, about what's happening in and around Venezuela is that we are not at war. We just mentioned the wars that you were involved with, the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. No such situation exists today, yet we are apparently, it would seem, close to going to war against Venezuela, and that blowing up these drug boats have been, or the alleged drug boats have been justified as if we are at war. But the important thing to note is that we are not at war. So everything that's happening in the Caribbean now is essentially illegal, is it not?
Yes, it is. And this is, a theme and a point that I've been trying to emphasize in media engagements for months now, since the first strike in September became public, was that the Trump administration, even before they, seemingly, because I'm not sure when they put together their still classified Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel legal memorandum that supposedly tries to justify these strikes as lawful. I've been emphasizing that the Trump administration is exploiting, trying to abuse the incredible, and very expanded authority to use lethal force during an actual armed conflict, during war, that exists, during the legal paradigm that replaces peacetime law enforcement legal authorities for when a government agent, such as a police officer down, here in downtown Los Angeles, or the Coast Guard on the high seas, when they can use force with the ability to use force based on status. So let me explain here. As you know, Ian, and as most Americans know, our police officers can only use deadly force when it's absolutely necessary. When they face an imminent threat of deadly force, they can proportionally use deadly force in response in order to protect themselves or others from that imminent deadly threat. In war, one of the biggest legal differences regarding the authority to use lethal force, the ability to kill people, is that in war, the United States and other warring parties can kill people based on status, based on who they are, and not just on what they're doing. In the rest of the world, and the rest of the time, police and government agents can kill people based on what they're doing. Just like you and I could. If someone pulled a gun on us, is about to kill us, we can use lethal force in response to, out of, pure self-defense. So that, that's why determining when we're actually in an armed conflict and when we're not is a life or death, literally, determination, because it triggers then this authority to use force to go after the opposing army. And so the law of war has made this trade-off, this ultimate trade-off, which is, look, individuals that belong to, and it's all predicated upon the analogy of that we're fighting an armed force, such as a military. When you're fighting a military, all those individuals are part of the military, and their job is to kill the enemy. And your job is to kill them. And so as long as they are not incapacitated, that is out of the fight because they're a prisoner of war, they're either on the battlefield and they're unable to fight because of wounds or sickness or surrender, you can kill them even when they're sleeping in their barracks, or even when they're on some Navy ship during time of war on the high seas. That's the best time to kill them, is when they're not expecting it. You can kill them because of who they are. That analogy does apply to folks that aren't in the military, but in what are called non-state armed groups. And this is where this becomes key. So, for example, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but let's go back to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a group that was organized to such a degree that it could carry out protracted, intense violence, that is, hostilities against the United States like it was a military. And in fact, we saw that because it successfully, tragically attacked us on 9/11. Therefore, the United States was immediately in what the law calls a non-international armed conflict. And it calls it non-international because Al-Qaeda was not a state. It was not Russia versus Ukraine, which is an international armed conflict. But we were at war immediately against Al-Qaeda. And why? Because they are an organized armed group that had the capability and obviously the will to engage in, a protracted level of violence. And here they engaged in violence, and there was intelligence they were going to engage in further levels of violence against the United States. So we're immediately at war. So we can be at war against non-state armed groups. We could be at war against terrorist organizations such as ISIS. ISIS, of course, was born in United States military detention in Camp Bucca, Iraq, where the United States was improperly detaining thousands of military-age males and allowing them to all be indoctrinated in our own detention. So we helped contribute to that, unfortunately. But ISIS developed and became an organized armed group with such lethality and capability that they began killing American soldiers, taking over large swaths of Iraq and other areas there in the Middle East and engage in actual hostilities. And so for us to be engaged in, as the Trump administration has claimed, to be in a non-international armed conflict against any armed group, and apparently they're claiming Trendia Ragua and some other groups that they have not released yet, and some that they have released. These groups have to be, one, organized to a level of degree that they are capable of mounting, capable of mounting a high levels of violence, like they were a military. And number two, they're actually engaged in protracted violence against the United States such that our regular law enforcement capabilities can't counter it. That the government has to make a decision. We've got to use the military here because we just can't handle these folks using regular law enforcement. Where is the threat? And this really just gives up the ghost. First of all, the level of organization isn't there. Number two, where's the protracted level of hostilities against the United States? These folks aren't trying to violently attack the United States. They're trying to sell the United States drugs. And so the Trump administration has said time and time again, look, these folks are carrying drugs. It's poison. That poison poses a threat to the United States, and therefore we're just going to blow them out of the water. That is not an armed conflict by the very facts that the government is saying. Even though the Trump administration throws on this, scary boogeyman label, narco terrorists, these are terrorists. And they've declared some of these groups and put them on what's called the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And that's promulgated under federal law. It's a designation that federal law, Congress has allowed the State Department to make. And by putting an organization on this list, that does not mean we're allowed to kill them summarily. It allows the United States by law, and we are a country that runs hopefully still by the rule of law, even though this is completely outside of that. The Foreign Terrorist Organization designation is one that allows the government to cut off funding for these groups, to provide for sanctions against these groups. It does not allow the United States to kill them summarily on the high seas. Boom, period, dot. I don't care how many times we jump up and down and call someone a terrorist. That does not mean there is legal authority to execute them. So, and second of all, it allows for criminal penalties for anyone that knowingly provides material support to one of these groups, primarily money, but also if someone tried to join one of these groups. It allows for the government not to kill them, but to arrest them and to prosecute them using our full panoply of criminal justice and the due process that's embedded within our criminal justice process. So this entire narrative, this military campaign of blowing boats out of the water is something that President Trump publicly said he wanted to do in 2023. There's interviews going back to President Trump in 2023, and then he was no longer the president. But he said, look, we just need to kill these guys. We're just going to kill them. Well, that's called murder. And the federal murder statute applies because it applies on the high seas and international waters due to our special U.S. federal law, special maritime jurisdiction. An intentional killing, unlawful killing, when someone is not posing an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death, is murder. when we're not in an armed conflict. If we were in an armed conflict, if individuals were determined to belong to a hostile group that was actually part of an armed conflict, as long as they're not out of the fight, they can be killed based on their status. But this is not a war. This has never been a war. An armed conflict is just the modern term for war. And therefore, this is just cold-blooded murder being perpetrated on behalf of the American people, complicit with the complicit. American people are being complicit if we're not demanding that our congressmen and women actually put a stop to this. And here's, Ian, as you know, there has been a resolution that was put forward on a bipartisan front, but it failed on party lines. I think maybe there were two defectors that demanded an end to these targeted killings, to this campaign of murder, and it failed. And I'm hoping that the second incident that you can ask me about here in a moment, really started to bring in a stark relief that this entire operation is it's not pragmatically smart. How can you dismantle a drug smuggling organization, if you can't interview, that is, interrogate the individuals to be able to, because we're shooting fish in a barrel, taking out these small boats. Instead, the Coast Guard interdicted over 200 boats in the last year. They board them, they detain them, they ask questions, and when they find, and many of these developed into, okay, you arrest them, there's probable cause, you have evidence of drug smuggling, you interview them, then you start to build up the intelligence on the entire drug smuggling, organization, and that's how you can go after the higher level ones instead of just killing people and putting the evidence on the bottom of the ocean. So pragmatically, policy-wise, this is dumb. And it's ineffective, and it's already caused some of our allies to stop sharing intelligence with us on these drug operations. It's morally wrong, and it's unlawful. It's unlawful. It's murder, and it puts our military really in a dangerous predicament in which they're faced with unlawful orders that they would have to disobey at their peril. And unfortunately, we haven't seen enough disobedience.
Well, it does feel like we're being softened up for some kind of a war, and this 15% of the Navy's assets are there. And it reminds me of the WMD in Iraq, which was a kind of softening up process, that there's a real threat. In this case, they wanted to have the videos of these boats being blown up, but they won't let us see the second strike on the boat that was struck on September the 2nd. And there's emerging evidence of war crimes following these closed-door intelligence briefings at which a select group of Republican and Democratic lawmakers saw the full video of the September 2nd strike on the small boat allegedly shipping drugs to the United States. Now we're learning that they're actually shipping drugs to Suriname. But in spite of this, there was the alternative reality expressed by Senator Cotton. But it does seem that the second missile strike on Hegseth orders to kill them all was murder on the high seas. So when do you think the public will see this video? That would settle everything, wouldn't it? To see the 40-minute video resulting in the second strike on these two hapless guys on a piece of flotsam waving at the drone trying to surrender.
Well, I have several points to make in response to that. And first of all, I'm not sure it's going to settle everything, because there seems to be a growing solidification along party lines here, making this a very partisan issue, that folks are just going to fall in line and just follow Trump blindly, despite the path of illegality that he's bringing the United States on and putting our military directly in the middle of. Number two, let's talk about this. First of all, I'm not going to call this a war crime, because you have to have a war for there to be a war crime. It's murder. And the second strike was doubly murder and even more cruel. And that's why that it hasn't been released to the American public yet. Because it's easy, just like you think of our executions and where the states that still have the death penalty. Very few folks see that, right? Because if most Americans had to look at someone that the government's putting to death on our behalf, they're very uncomfortable with that. If Americans can see helpless, shipwrecked individuals who had just survived attempted murder, desperately waving to the drones overhead to save them, and we wait 40 minutes and watching their desperation, waiting for the smoke to clear, debating back and forth, which required zero debate. I'm disgusted in the Navy and in Admiral Bradley that was even any kind of discussion on this. It should have immediately been, where are the assets that we can send in to save these individuals? There was an utter failure of command leadership on this, period. But there's no war. That's not a war crime. It's murder. But I do believe the American public would react very viscerally to seeing our American military acting in such a cruel fashion, and they were put in that position, but directly by Secretary Hegseth, who's happy to throw Admiral Bradley under the bus. Secretary Hegseth is also happy to come up with all sorts. I mean, when is he lying, right? He's given several different inconsistent statements of what actually happened, right? Just and then posted sophomorically as a Ninja Turtle on Twitter, just acting like that taking people's lives is just a joke, that this is a video game. This isn't real war. This isn't a battlefield in which the United States service members are engaged with the enemy who's fighting them. There is no fight, unlike Senator Cotton said. These guys were trying to get back in the fight. The fight of what? There's cocaine on those boats. It's not a nuclear weapon.
Right.
There is
Well,
no imminent threat, and this is plain old murder. And I've been so troubled by the fact of the lack of outrage of American people at this. There was a poll taken in the end of October, and it showed that a majority of, at least of those polled and extrapolated to America, they said a majority of Americans are uncomfortable with this. They didn't like it, but I mean, maybe there's outrage overload because we also have an outrageous immigration enforcement policy going on in which children are being ripped from their parents. We've got Black Hawk helicopters in Chicago where, these wannabe Navy SEALs are rappelling down into homes and ripping people out of showers. I mean, what kind of country are we allowing ourselves to be in right now? I want the American people to wake up and put a lot of pressure on Congress to actually put an end to this, because Congress ultimately has the power of the purse, and they have a National Defense Authorization Act that they pass every year, and they could be putting a kibosh on a lot of this. They could be passing some of these resolutions. They could be standing up and finding their intestinal fortitude to tell President Trump, yeah, this is enough. We're not going to do this in the American people's name.
so just in the last couple of minutes, Rachel, do you think, though, that the 800 flag officers, generals and admirals that were called to that ridiculous briefing in Quantico by Hegseth, where he strutted around in that Fox News style and talked about all of his ludicrous notions that somehow the United States military is no longer lethal, and you have to forget about all the restraints and the wokeness, and you just got to go out and kill people? They were clearly uncomfortable. Is there anything they can do to stop this guy who's got the power to fire them, and he's firing all of the talented people, all of the minorities, and all of the women and the highest ranks? But still, I wonder, just in closing here, Rachel, is there anything that the military can do? Because they clearly know that this is wrong.
Yes, they can follow Admiral Halsey's honorable stand and resign. Admiral Bradley, if he had honor, would be resigning right now. So if our senior leaders receive an unlawful order, such as to carry out these murders in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, they should refuse the orders and, if necessary, resign with honor, such as Admiral Halsey did. Admiral Bradley would say, I'm not going to do this anymore. He could try to compensate for his failure of leadership in passing on unlawful orders in this campaign of murder, and in particular that second strike. And he could be resigning. And that's what honorable men and women need to do, especially it's the top, right? And so I appreciated the public service announcement from the 6 congressmen and women led by the Honorable Senator Kelly and Senator Slotkin, reminding military members they have a duty to disobey unlawful orders. But it's really, really hard the lower you go down in ranks, because you disobey at your peril. And you've got the baloney Office of Legal Counsel memo trying to legally rationalize that all this is fine. And you've got the top military lawyers and as you fired already, and then you already had other top leaders being summarily pushed out and fired. So it makes it really difficult to disobey an order at your peril. But that's what our 3 and 4 stars, like Admiral Bradley, that's what they're paid to do. They're paid to make these hard calls and to sacrifice their own career for the good of those underneath them and for the good of their oath to the Constitution. That's what I expect them to do. Do what Admiral Halsey did and resign.
Rachel VanLandingham, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
And refuse orders. Thank you so much. Refuse those unlawful orders. Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Rachel VanLandingham, who is a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the Co-Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School, as well as a former judge advocate in the United States Air Force. During her military career, she served as a senior legal advisor on the international law of armed conflict, military prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, appellate defense attorney, and nuclear security inspector stationed in the United States, South Korea, and Italy, with deployments to the Middle East. She was the legal advisor for international law at Headquarters United States Central Command, where she advised on operational and international legal issues related to the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're going to take a brief station break and back examining the Supreme Court's overturning of a lower court in Texas that halted the implementation of a gerrymandered electoral map Trump demanded of Governor Abbott that would give Republicans 30 of the 38 House seats in next year's election before a vote is cast.
They call it murder.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Lydia Camarillo, who serves as the president of the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based out of San Antonio, Texas. She plays a key role in developing the tactical strategies for the SVREP nonpartisan voter registration, voter education, and get out the vote campaigns. And President Clinton and Vice President Gore appointed Lydia to serve as the CEO of the 2000 Democratic National Convention. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lydia Camarillo.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And on Thursday, the Supreme Court overturned a lower court in Texas that had halted the implementation of the gerrymandered electoral map that President Trump demanded of Governor Abbott, who obliged, and this would give the Republicans 30 of the 38 House seats in next year's election before a vote is cast. And what's extraordinary about the ruling is that Justice Alito said it was indisputable that the motivation for the redistricting was pure and simple partisan advantage, and he also went on to chastise the lowest court for failing to honor the presumption of legislative good faith. I don't know that that's a way to describe the far right-wing Texas legislature, but the point is surely, Lydia, that even if you say that it's okay to gerrymander for partisan advantage, the result will be racial gerrymandering, that the minorities districts in Texas will be disappeared and minority voters will be disenfranchised. So isn't that racial gerrymandering?
That is, in fact, what took place and what is taking place in the redistricting for Texas in the 2025 mid-decade maps. And clearly the courts agreed with our assessment in a 2-to-1 vote that the courts in the El Paso federal courts said that we are right, that it was a racial, that it eliminates 5 Latino majority districts that also impact African-American voters, because once you move certain lines, you're going to have an impact on the adjacent districts. So we are losing 5 Latino majority districts where the Latino community will no longer have the opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. That's devastating, and at the same time, it's not surprising. Once we won before the 2-to-1 San El Paso federal court, we knew we were going to lose. If we thought we could lose if it ended up before the United States Supreme Court. Now, here's the good news, as if there's any good news, and that is we get to litigate the merits of the case. However, this map, the 2025 map, is going to be implemented, take effect for the 2026 primary and general elections. That means that, for example, in District CD 35, where Congressman Cesar, which is the district that's from San Antonio all the way to Austin, is no longer going to run in that district. He has filed to run for a member of Congress in the 37th. And because he's filing to run in the district in the 37th, that means that Lloyd Doggett has decided to retire and will no longer run for Congress. We still do not know the absolute impact in terms of the actual 5 districts that were redrawn and that are dismantled as a voting rights Section 2 district, which is 28, 29, 33, 34, and 35. And like I said, adjacent districts are also impacted. What we do know is that candidates must file on December the 8th to see where they're going to run. And we also know that voters are completely disenfranchised and will not have an opportunity to determine who will represent them in their districts in the 2026 elections. Our case will continue to move forward under LULAC versus Abbott. Waldorf is our representative, legal representative, and I trust that they will give it a good fight to make sure that we win and that we demonstrate, as the federal court has stated, in a 2-to-1 vote. One of the Republican judges was appointed by Trump, which clearly says that the districts were run to discriminate on the basis of race, and it was not drawn only on a partisan basis.
And you're talking about the November 18th ruling by these 2 federal judges that barred Texas from using the new map in 2026. And it was the Galveston District Judge Jeffrey Brown, who is a Trump appointee, that wrote the ruling. And this was a 160-page ruling. They did 9 days worth of hearings. And then the Supreme Court just literally overnight, in a shadow docket, came out with a 5-paragraph opinion dismissing the whole thing. So there's the contrast between the lower courts really getting into the subject matter and doing due diligence, and the Supreme Court cavalierly just erasing it.
That is correct. And as I said, if there's any light at the end of the tunnel, is that we still get a chance to litigate on the merits of the case, which we hope to prevail given the results of the federal lower court in El Paso. But unfortunately, voters will not be able to vote if we win until 2028. And then come 2030, it's time to change the districts after the census. And so we're losing a lot of time. Let us not forget that our lawsuit is not only suggesting that the 2025 maps that were drawn violate the Voting Rights Act and eliminate 5 congressional districts that were drawn as Latino majority districts under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, but that there are other districts that we filed a lawsuit in the 2021 lawsuit. That case is still pending as well.
And you were a party, of course, the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, to the case that was announced on November the 18th by the District Judge Jeffrey Brown, the Trump appointee. It ruled in your favor, and the Supreme Court just on Thursday overturned it. And it's pretty extraordinary to think that Texas's Attorney General Ken Paxton described the cases against the Texas gerrymandering, saying that every conservative who is tired of watching the left try to upend the political system with bogus lawsuits. Well, how can you say that this is the left when Judge Jeffrey Brown is a Trump appointee?
That's correct. And the thing about Judge Jeffrey Brown is that the whole point about his assessment in our favor, he stated that he was following the letter of the law. If you follow the letter of the law and not the politics, then the result has to be in favor of the plaintiffs. And while we are one of several organizations, including LULAC, because LULAC's the case is called LULAC versus Abbott, there are also other groups that this case was consolidated with. but it includes individuals who reside in those districts who are impacted. And so it's unfortunate that most recently we believed that the branch that would continue to follow the law would be the judges, and certainly the United States Supreme Court. And what we're finding is that in the latest rulings that they have had, not only in this one, but in others, they're basically following their politics, not the letter of the law.
And that was made pretty clear in the dissent by the three Democratic appointees. It was a pretty vigorous dissent from Justice Elena Kagan. The three liberal justices, along with Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, who wrote the dissenting opinion, criticized the court for reversing Judge Brown's 160-page ruling, quote, based on its perusal over a holiday weekend of a cold paper record. Today's order disrespects the work of a district court that did everything it could to carry out its charge. Today's order disserves the millions of Texans whom the district court found were assigned to their new districts based on their race. So there you have it. So I think, though, Lydia, you have to put this into a broader context. I mean, for a start, what's the demographic breakdown in Texas? I thought it was pretty close to 50-50 in minority and white.
I think you asking that question is really relevant and important, and I appreciate you asking that. The state, according to the last numbers at the end of the 2024, it is 31 million, of which 13 million are Latinos and 12 million are white voters, white people rather, white folks. 3.6 million are Asian, African American, 1.7 million are Asian, and then an estimated 368,000, a little bit over, are mixed races and other. What it basically means is that Texas is a majority minority state, yet what they have done by dismantling and eliminating the 5 districts is that now we only have 4 Latino majority districts left out of the 9 we had. And given the number of congressional districts and the population growth, which was powered by the Latino community and other communities of color, it should have increased the number of districts that were drawn to support the opportunity for Latino voters to decide their districts. We should have gone from 9 congressional districts that were drawn as Latino to 12 at the very minimum. But it basically, at the bottom line, means that more than 80% of the districts are drawn where white voters are deciding the future of a state that is majority minority.
So you have essentially 60% of the state minority, 40% white, and out of the 38 congressional seats, 30 of them will be white, and only 8 will be minority. That ought to tell the picture clear as you can possibly do, right?
Correct. It also means that the people that lose are the Texas community. That includes everybody, not just Latinos. And we lose as a nation because, as we all know, the country is looking at other states are considering whether or not they should be conducting redistricting in the middle of the decade. And it's also propelling future opportunities. It won't necessarily just be in the middle. It'll be at the whim of those in control to say, we are going to change the dynamics every election because now we've seen Texas say that it's okay to do this. And therefore, we can change what it looks like. We know that already Ohio, North Carolina, Utah are changing the redistricting. And we also know that on the Democratic side, Virginia is thinking about doing it. But the point is that once we continue to move forward on this point, we have a problem because it can be done at any time. We also know that California decided to pass Prop 50 to change the congressional districts and respond to Texas. But I tell you, the nation will not be able to make a complete change, and Democrats won't be able to make a complete win on the Democratic side because there's not enough opportunities out there. And at the end of the day, what's happening is that democracy erodes and democracy loses, and the country are the ones that lose.
So I just wanted to, just in the last minute though, basically broaden out the picture, which is what we've done in terms of the demographic breakdown of Texas, which is 60% minority, 40% white. You've had a couple of appalling incidents that would indicate incredible racism at the highest level in this government, coming from both President Trump and from his co-president, Stephen Miller. It's the only way that you can describe the horrible treatment of detainees in Alligator Alcatraz, where the Amnesty International has found that immigrants at this Florida facility were shackled to a 2-foot-high metal cage and left outside without water for up to a day. And on Friday, the Democratic Congresswoman who just got seated from Arizona after a 50-day delay by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, she was pepper sprayed during an ICE raid in Arizona on Friday. So this is blatant racism, on the top of which President Trump has warned that Europe faces civilization erasure, which is a version of the Great Replacement theory. So it seems that Latinos in this country are under attack. It's undisputable.
Yeah, I sometimes have a difficult time finding the correct words. They started with when Trump decided to run the first round in 2016 for president, when he called all of us not only criminals, but rapists and, as he said, bad hombres to some of our community. But I can't imagine in other countries allowing this to happen. And I never thought that in the United States we would have a situation where a president would be outright racist comments and he would continue to succeed. But worse, the judges before the Supreme Court continue to allow him to do that by giving him presidential immunity and allowing for the redistricting case to violate the Voting Rights Act of Section 2. And as we know, there's another case where they're trying to eliminate our birthright. So it's a fight that we have. Latinos have been under attack for a while now with this president. We also are very worried that communities that are not citizens are finding themselves in a situation where they live in fear and are being deported to sometimes countries that they don't know, or those that are being deported that were brought here as children. They have no idea about their language and the culture where they come from because they've lived here since children. And the worst is that they are deporting and attacking and picking up United States citizens as well. It's a fight that we all have to take, and part of the fight includes our case. If I bring back to our case on the redistricting, we will see what we can do from now until the next election to demonstrate to the United States Supreme Court and others that the federal court in their ruling of 2-1 was correct to stand with our position in our case to block the midterm redistricting maps that violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, Lydia Camarillo, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Lydia Camarillo, who serves as the president of the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in San Antonio, Texas. She plays a key role in developing the tactical strategies for the SVREP nonpartisan voter registration, voter education, and Get Out the Vote campaigns. And President Clinton and Vice President Gore appointed Lydia to serve as the CEO of the 2000 Democratic National Convention. We're going to take a brief station break, and background briefing. Gen Z reporter Sasha Linden-Cohen will be interviewing one of the pollsters for the Harvard Youth Poll that finds that only 13% of Americans between 18 and 19 say the U.S. is heading in the right direction, with only 39% supporting capitalism.
Tell it to the judge on Sunday. Tell it to him, leave me alone. Tell it to the judge on Sunday. You can call him at home.
Welcome back. You're listening to Background Briefing. I'm Sasha Linden Cohen, and next we're going to be talking about the Harvard Kennedy School's recent youth poll. It's a study they conduct twice a year, and the results of this most recent one were frankly pretty bleak, with young people really feeling anxious about their future economically, politically, and otherwise. Jordan Schwartz is a sophomore at Harvard University, and he served as the student chair for the study. So he's here with me now to unpack some of the findings. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jordan.
Thanks for having me, Sasha.
Well, first of all, congrats on the study. The findings were really interesting and provided a helpful window for understanding how public trust is eroding among different demographics. And I want to talk about the data eventually, but I first wanted to ask what it's like being a student and a young person who's also seeing what these findings look like in real life. I am, of course, several years older than you, but I'm still part of Gen Z, and I feel like a lot of the results affirmed what I witnessed among my friends, namely a lot of Democrats seeming to be hypercritical of their own party, continuing to vote for Democrats only really out of frustration rather than excitement. Republicans seem to have a little more loyalty to their party. Can you tell me about what the results or how the results measured up to your anecdotal experience of where young people are at politically and socially, at least at Harvard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the results are not super surprising, despite the fact that they are extraordinarily pessimistic. And in my personal experience, both, with my peers here at Harvard and back home and everywhere I talk to other young people, this does seem to be the reality. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you'll have, economic data that diverges from what people are saying about their own economic state at a certain point in time. But with this poll in particular, across just about every question we've asked, the big takeaway seems to be that young people are struggling. And it's exactly what you hear from them when you talk to them in person. Finances are tight. The world's uncertain. And, the political scene is not one that they're happy with, not with the Democratic Party, not with the Republican Party. They don't see a great way forward. And until that changes, the results are probably going to continue to be pretty bleak.
Was there anything in particular that surprised you in the results? Anything good, bad, in between that you were expecting one direction and it turned out another? Or did the results sort of affirm your projections that things would be bleak?
There was actually one, I think, rare point of light in the results, despite all of this. And it was that, young people, as we've established, really don't trust the government. They don't trust each other. They don't trust the future, their jobs, finances, everything. But somehow, despite all of that, you'd expect them to become more politically apathetic. And it turns out that that's really not the case. So we ask a question leading up to the midterms every cycle about how likely they are to vote. And the likelihood that our sample predicted, which of course, major caveat that it's still a year out from the midterms, is just as high as it was, 4 years ago and 8 years ago, before two pretty high voter turnout midterms. And so I think the big takeaway there is that young people, despite feeling extraordinarily disillusioned with the world around them, are also willing to try and put it back on the right track. They want to see change. They're just not seeing it around them right now.
I wonder about what your methodology, sample size, where were you pulling from? Because I feel like so much reporting that we see is how young people are apathetic, young people aren't voting, and I'm curious where you drew your data from. I know there's a lot of census data involved, but can you tell me a bit about the methodology?
Yeah, 100%. I love getting into the details on this. So our poll is conducted via Ipsos Public Affairs with their knowledge panel technology, which is usually considered to be one of the gold standard technologies for academic survey research. And basically the way it works is it produces a random sample of young people from across the country where everyone has an equal probability of being polled. And what they do is they send out invitations to join the panel based on addresses, a random sampling of addresses across the country. And then from that random panel that they've drawn, they recruit for us each semester about 2,000 or so respondents who, take our poll, and then we further weight that based on from population characteristics, to make sure that we have the proper proportions of young men, young women, different racial groups, party ID, and so on and so forth. So with that data set, once it's weighted, we're able to go through and really have a pretty accurate representation of what the whole Gen Z cohort should look like.
And so that sort of dispelled, in some ways, the popular belief that young people are not politically engaged or do not want to be politically engaged, or their frustrations are causing major apathy. This was a
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think young people would probably be even more active in politics if they thought that they were able to make more of a change than they could right now. But that being said, they are still extremely active, and we've seen this for the past few election cycles. In 2018 and 2020 in particular, we saw the highest youth voter turnout in modern history. And while 2022 and 2024 weren't quite as high, if you don't include 2018 and 2020, they still would have set records. And so I think the overall trend over the past few decades has still been positive in terms of young people engaging in politics. And I'm really excited to see what happens next year with the midterms. And, you'll have two wonderful Harvard Youth polls before that you should definitely talk to the next chair for. But I do think that, young people want to be active. They want to contribute. They want to talk to people about politics, even if it's uncomfortable right now. And that was, I think, one of the biggest takeaways for me from some of the more qualitative research we've done as well. We went to New York ahead of the mayoral election about a month ago, and we conducted a focus group with 12 young voters from across the political spectrum of New York, that is to say. But I think it is pretty reflective of, at least in this aspect, the overall national cohort of Gen Z, where, we're asking them questions for 2 hours about politics, about everyday life. And without exception, every single one of them at the end basically told us, how can we do this more often? How can we do this again? How can we just discuss these things that are going on around us in our daily lives? And that is probably the single most common theme we've had from everyone we've talked to in focus groups, in poll results, in random street interviews we've done, that a lot of young people want to talk about politics. They want to express even everything that they think is going wrong, hopefully for the sake of fixing it.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's interesting you bring up Zoran, because I feel like there has been a lot of conversation about more local elections. I mean, Michelle Wu, for one thing, Zoran, it feels like there's a lot of progressive energy in cities around candidates that isn't often being translated to Congress, to the Senate races. So I wondered, did you get any information on, I guess, the fact that people might be more energized by elections that they feel they can sway in some way?
Yeah, we didn't ask any questions in specific about that, but I do think based on our experience in New York, that seems to be a pretty accurate conclusion. I will say, interestingly enough, we asked a couple questions this year about identifying with different ideological labels. And we last asked these questions in 2020. And we consider labels, like capitalism, socialism, democratic socialism. And now this year, for the first time, we asked about the MAGA movement as well. And interestingly enough, overall support and identification with each of these labels, capitalism on one side, socialism on the other, both fell. And I think it really just represents how young people are struggling to identify with any one particular solution or movement or ideology right now, and are increasingly just distancing themselves from all of it because they haven't really seen any one thing that might work. So there's been all this discourse about how, democratic socialism is on the rise, and maybe it's been pretty flat within the Democratic Party, but it's actually falling overall in terms of support among most of Gen Z. But it's some of the arguments that are made by democratic socialists, arguments on affordability, like what we saw from the Mamdani campaign, that are really resonating. This idea that, look, we know you're struggling, we understand it is hard to get by, we know you don't know what the future holds, we're going to try and have your back. And I think that message of just, we're going to try to have your back, is the single most important thing any politician or leader can take away from polls like this.
Absolutely. And because that message of affordability is the one that's really driving home right now and seems to be the biggest concern for young people, and I think probably the general public alike. I wanted to pivot for a second because I have sort of a obsession with a particular issue that you had some findings on, which is AI. It stood out to me that half of young Democrats, or a little over half, believe that AI will take away more opportunity than it creates, compared with less Republicans, about 37%. And I am curious about really just the vibe on college campuses as it relates to generative AI. There has been a lot of reporting on the more material consequences, like data centers and water usage and skyrocketing energy costs. But I find that one of the most dangerous consequences of these LLMs is the outsourcing of critical thinking. It seems really scary to me. And I graduated in 2020, so I kind of got out by the skin of my teeth. ChatGPT wasn't released yet. And I'm curious, in addition to thinking about it in relation to your job prospects, what are public conceptions of AI among students? How has it changed campus culture and academic culture? And how do you see that play out in the poll results?
Ooh, so many good questions. And I'm so glad you went here because I love the AI findings. Not necessarily what they say, but just the fact that we have data on them. And, I think it goes back to, at least in terms of my experiences with my peers using AI and even my own AI use, it really has taken over college campuses over the past few years. Like a lot of classes have policies that AI shouldn't be used for coursework. Like obviously it shouldn't be generating, your final papers or doing your problem sets for you or anything of that sort. But both in terms of how young people learn about things and even just doing the critical thinking in everyday life for writing emails or responding to a professor or creating, any sort of flyer maybe for an event. AI has taken such a massive role in our everyday lives. And if this is happening in only a few years, I can't imagine where it's going to go in the next 5. But transitioning over to our specific poll results on AI, they really don't paint a positive picture, which, might not be too surprising given that the entire poll doesn't paint that positive of a picture. But on AI in particular, I think it's just fascinating that, usually when there's a new technology, it's young people who adopt it first, who are the really vanguard of progress in that regard. And when it comes to AI, that really just isn't the case. We don't have data on what the older generations would say on these same questions, but young people are surprisingly very pessimistic on what AI will do both to their life, their job prospects, their careers. And it really is just stunning. So by a more than 3-to-1 margin, young Americans say that AI will take away opportunities more so than it will create new ones. Which, just for starters, that's an insane statistic. But then we also asked a similar question on whether artificial intelligence will make work more or less meaningful. And the results are likewise nearly a 3-to-1 margin saying less meaningful, not more meaningful, which goes against the whole thesis that so many people have been talking about, that AI is supposed to take away the meaningless grunt work and allow people to focus on what they care about. Young people, so far at least, don't see it that way. And then when we look at sort of the threats to job prospects side of things, we asked a question of, do you see AI as more helpful or how big of a threat, do you think AI is to your job prospects? And 59% see it as a threat. Compare that to immigration, only 31%, outsourcing 48%. So these two things that are traditionally, seen as one of the biggest threats to people's jobs, especially entry-level jobs, significantly lower than AI is seen as a threat today.
Wow, that's so interesting considering immigration is sort of marketed to us as like the number one issue, and a super partisan issue at that. But actually, people across the board think that AI is a threat to their jobs. And it doesn't seem to have taken a particularly partisan. We did a segment a few weeks ago about how a journalist was advocating for Democrats to really take on AI as their particular issue area, specifically data centers. But it doesn't feel like anti-AI has become affiliated with any one party quite yet. And it's not being used to campaign on. But also, part of that might be because people have come to rely on it and you can't really stimmy that demand once it exists.
Yeah, and I'll say even on campus, I think there's sort of a partisan divide, but not in the way you'd expect. A lot of Democrats are definitely very distrustful of AI for a variety of reasons, but part of it is that because it's so grounded in different large corporations and tech companies, a lot of progressive Democrats in particular are a little concerned. But then if you go to the Republican side of the aisle, and honestly, these have been some of my most interesting conversations on the issue with people. There's this big split among young Republicans, and you can sort of see this reflected in the data, where a slightly higher percentage of young Republicans think that AI could create more opportunities, even though more still think it'll take them away. But you've got really a split between two groups of Republicans, the tech bros, if you will, who are more of the Elon Musk type, who really see AI as a necessary form of progress and an important type of innovation. And then on the other hand, you have the more traditional religious conservatives who see AI as, almost a really negative reflection on our humanity and departing from those religious values that they hold so dear. And I'll be really interested to see where that heads in the next few years or decades, because I could see that split getting even larger.
Absolutely. Well, That is about all the time we have for today, and there is so much more to talk about. But Jordan, I really appreciated chatting with you, and congratulations again on the study.
Thanks so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Jordan Schwartz, a junior studying political science at Harvard University. He serves as the chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project, which runs the flagship Harvard Youth Poll, which is the premier survey on the political opinions and civic attitudes of young Americans aged 18 to 29, which just released their findings for fall of 2025.
We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into how Chief Justice Roberts just gave the Republicans 5 more House seats in Texas and is about to kill off the Voting Rights Act and hand Trump the power to fire independent agency officials at will.
We could flood the streets with love or light or heat, whatever. Lock the parents out, cut a rug, twist and shout, wave your hands, make it rain. The stars will rise again. The youth is starting to change. Are you starting to change? Are you together, 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 together? The youth is starting.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the United States Supreme Court and other levels of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF, and has served as a senior advisor in all 3 branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. She's the author of the new book, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and His Accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lisa Graves.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's a joy to be on your show.
Well, thanks for joining us, but I'm afraid it's a very unpleasant task to try and alert the American people to how they've been conned by this genial fellow who said he would only call balls and strikes, John Roberts, the Chief Justice. It turns out to be the most dedicated ideologue on the Supreme Court. He's not as outrageous and crazy as the Clarence Thomases and the Alitos. He's low key, but he's so much more effective. And going back to his days in the Reagan administration, he's always believed in the unitary executive idea of almost unlimited executive power. And he's handing that to Donald Trump, who has to be the most dangerous, reckless, incompetent, and cruel and stupid president in the entire history of the United States.
Yeah, that sums it up well. It really is astonishing because Roberts was so effective at the PR to set his image in people's minds as this umpire, but he's really been at bat and hitting some real home runs, not for the American people, but for the revolutionary legal ideas that he is putting forward, including cases coming up this week that could reverse and are likely to reverse nearly a century of legal precedents to further expand the powers of Donald Trump. And so it's really hard to fathom, I think, for many people how we got here. But in fact, what happened is that John Roberts was chosen for this role. He was the first beneficiary of the No More Suitors campaign, which was an effort that was also animated by the Federal Society members to say that they did not want a judge who was going to be fair like David Souter. He was the appointee who was the former New Hampshire Supreme Court justice, and he dared to follow precedent. We saw during that nomination 20 years ago for John Roberts how he was basically the golden boy for them. And then as soon as he was confirmed, Bush nominated his counsel, Harriet Miers, and there was just a hue and cry from Robert Bork and others saying that, you know, she was not part of the farm team, basically. She could not be trusted, in essence, to advance this agenda. So she was pulled back and Alito was put in her place. And now we're seeing the fruits of that effort to capture the court, to roll back our rights.
Well, we don't need any more evidence, surely, after what happened on Thursday, where the Roberts Court just gave the Republicans 5 more House seats in Texas, making that 30 seats out of 38. And yet the state of Texas is 60% minority, 40% white. And yet there's basically only 8 minority seats out of the 38 left. I mean, it's so stark. And the reasoning is so outrageous. And it was actually a Trump appointed a judge who dismissed the case or froze the Texas gerrymandering map based on racial gerrymandering. And by the way, they had 9 days of hearings, and it's a 160-page finding. They did their homework. The Supreme Court over the weekend cavalierly just peruses it and comes out with a 5-paragraph shadow docket finding that's an insult to anybody's intelligence, just basically saying, it's an exercise in power. Oh, there's nothing wrong with the gerrymandering and this, this is just purely partisan advantage. And when it's so clearly racial gerrymandering, because the results will be that minorities in Texas will be disenfranchised. That is staring us on the wall. There's no way of getting around that.
That's right. The lower court found quite clearly, after listening to hours and hours of testimony, assessing the claims by the state of Texas, including the claims out of the governor's office, looking at the effects of this ruling, was that this remap by Texas at Trump's behest was that it would dilute the power of Black and brown voters and minority voters in the state of Texas, fellow Americans in Texas. And those detailed findings, as you point out, were cavalierly cast aside by the Roberts Court, the Roberts, faction on that court. And it is a stunning act that I consider to be illegitimate. It reveals starkly how hyper-partisan the Roberts Court is, where you have Republican appointees to the court putting their fist on the scale of justice to help Texas try to keep a Republican majority in the United States House of Representatives, and to do so despite detailed findings of the racial impact of that remapping. It just really makes you, I think, helps people understand that we cannot trust this court to protect our rights. We have to understand that this court is not going to save us. And in fact, this court is helping to drive power toward Donald Trump, toward this extreme agenda that is at odds with core democratic principles and flies in the face of the long-standing requirements of the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And they're poised to overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which would bring us back to Jim Crow. There would be virtually no minority Democrat representatives left in the South as a result of this. So the question, though, that I have, Lisa, is that given that this guy, Roberts, has always believed in the unitary executive and is doing everything he can to empower the executive branch at the expense of the legislative branch. And of course, you've got these supine, ridiculous, useless Republicans in the House and Senate who are intimidated by him and are just relinquishing their power in a craven way. That's almost unprecedented. But there's no logic to it in the sense that if you give the executive so much power, what happens when the Democrats take the White House? And then that means you're handing the same kind of power to the Democrats that you're handing to Trump. So I don't believe that that is their motive. I believe that you have to combine the Roberts executive push for a unitary executive with the notion that they plan to have a permanent one-party system in this country, like you have in Russia, where you have the ruling party. They allow the other parties to exist and compete, but the results are always predetermined. So it doesn't make any sense for him to work so hard to give Republicans so much power and to give the presidency so much power unless this is going to be a permanent situation for the Republicans.
I fear that. And as many people may recall, that was precisely the objective that Karl Rove said out loud about 2 decades ago, that they wanted to have a permanent Republican majority even though there have been some disagreements between Rove and Trump, the fact is that this court, which is really acting like a rogue court and not like a court at all, like an appendage of the Republican Party, is helping to advance that cause. That cause is utterly at odds with the democracy that our Constitution was designed to protect against. It's at odds with the language of the Constitution. It's at odds with our history. And yet, this court seems like it is drunk with power in its willingness to revisit and revise any precedents that it doesn't like, meaning that the people on that court don't like, regardless of what the law has said, regardless of what Congress has done. And as you point out, Congress has basically given over its power to Trump. The Republican-led Congress has. There's an opportunity in the midterms for there to be pushback through the voters to try to have some accountability, get some power in the House to block some of the most extreme actions, or have some negotiating power in the budget matters, or conduct oversight or impeachments, for example. And that's precisely what Donald Trump does not want to happen. He does not want to have any check on his power. And John Roberts and his fellow Republicans, his fellow Confederates, in essence, are basically doing his bidding, advancing this extreme notion of power that is really an extreme theory. It's been a fringe theory, but John Roberts has taken it up, this unitary executive theory, and he's doing so, like you said, for Trump, but in essence for what appears to be an effort to create a permanent Republican majority.
So I mentioned that the Supreme Court, or Roberts Court, is poised to kill off Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is what is at issue in the Texas case that was ruled on Thursday. So without that, then it's a free-for-all in terms of suppressing minority votes. And as I mentioned earlier, if it happens, there won't be any Democratic minority legislators left in the South. I mean, they'll all disappear. And that's basically will take us back to Jim Crow. But the other thing that they're about to do, and this will start on Monday, the hearings will begin on Monday, that Trump is about to hand the power to fire independent agency officials at will through Trump v. Slaughter. And this would mean that the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve Board system, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Election Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the National Transport Safety Board, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they all will be at risk, and Trump will be able to fire anybody that he doesn't like.
Yeah, I mean, that is the other really stinging moment that is about to happen, is this consolidation of power in ways that we know will be very disruptive of the rights of the American people, of the interests of the American people, because Trump is not appointing people to boards or to the cabinet who are actually qualified for those positions, who have records of merit, of fairness, of devotion to the broad interests of the American people, regardless of party. Instead, his test is loyalty. Are people loyal to him, to what he wants, to his dictates, to his whims, his caprice? That's the test. And those agencies have been structured by Congress to be bipartisan or nonpartisan in their own ways, and to have a balance of power so that we can have good results. We can have good advice. We can have trade policies that are the result, for example, of compromise, not of unilateral dictates. And so regardless of the consequences, it seems quite clear that John Roberts and his cohorts are pushing forward in this. I just re-examined the terrible immunity decision, the edict that John Roberts structured and constructed last year to give Donald Trump unprecedented immunity from criminal prosecution. And I noticed that in that ruling, that a little noticed part was that John Roberts sought to also carve out the pardon power and the power to fire any executive branch, employee, civil servant, whatsoever, as a power that was without limit. That's not actually what the law has said in America for decades and decades, but it's what John Roberts is articulating, and use that despicable opinion on immunity to try to further entrench that idea, which is not the law of the land, has not been the law of the land until John Roberts got a hold of the law, acting as really a political operative and not like a fair and independent judge.
And Roberts has just agreed to take up the birthright citizenship case. So What could happen there? Could they overturn the 14th Amendment or re-engineer it?
I mean, before last year, even I would have said that that was too remote of a threat. But now we see it happening in real time with Trump's assertions of this rewriting of the 14th Amendment. And we have a Chief Justice who just rewrote the Article 2 of the Constitution to create immunity out of nothing, where that part of the Constitution says nothing about immunity. In fact, says the job of the president is to faithfully execute the law. So even though a lot of scholars are saying, no, they'll leave birthright citizenship, which is expressly in the 14th Amendment, the first paragraph of it. I don't think we can count on anything being safe from this Supreme Court, because it really is out of control. It really is revisiting all previous precedents, all previous assumptions, and long-standing ways of thinking about these issues, and is using the court to basically enact an extreme sort of revolutionary set of ideas, and that could well fall too. I hope it won't. I hope that the hopeful people are right, that that's the bridge too far. But I don't know, because we just cannot have any confidence that this court will behave like a normal court, like a normal Supreme Court. And instead, what we're seeing in case after case is how willing Roberts is to set aside the law, and his fellow Republican appointees, as with these 24 extraordinary emergency orders, setting aside detailed factual findings, temporarily restraining Donald Trump, and instead giving him the go-ahead to go full speed ahead. So we're in a lot of trouble, and we need to have real court reform and have that be part of the conversation, because this court will continue to rip apart our rights until we reform it.
Well, Lisa Graves, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Lisa Graves, who's one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the United States Supreme Court and other levels of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF, and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Divisions for the U.S. Courts. And she's the author of the new book, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and his accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out.